Millionaire thought she would never be truly loved. Then the waiter came and Meredith folded the white linen napkin and passed it across her face carefully, as if afraid she might come undone right there at the brightest table in the Heritage Grill. The glass of red wine was in its place, the silverware arranged with precision, and the chair across from her was empty. It had been reserved for two. Only one had shown up. The message had arrived 43 minutes earlier. She knew the exact time because she had been staring at her phone with that look of someone hoping the words would change. It was 3 lines. "I can't make it today. Something came up. Sorry." And then nothing. No call. No explanation. Just the silence of someone who had already decided before sending the message. It was her birthday. 37 years old. And she was alone at a table for 2 in a restaurant, with crystal chandeliers and music playing in the background, surrounded by couples and families who occupied the space with an ease that stung her. It wasn't the first time. That was the part that hurt the most. Meredith Sterling had built over her adult life an impressive ability to hold things in. Heiress to a real estate and agricultural land empire her father had built over decades, she had taken over everything when he fell ill, still in her 20s. She had learned to sit at the head of meetings with men older than her and speak with an authority that hadn't come easily. She had learned to look at spreadsheets and see what others couldn't see. She had learned not to cry in front of anyone, but that night with her dark hair pinned up, the black spaghetti-strap dress she had carefully chosen weeks before, and that glass of wine she had barely touched, something slipped. The tear came before she could hold it back, and she quickly raised the napkin to her face, as if she could wipe away the evidence. The waiter approached with a discretion few would have mustered in that moment. He was a man of calm presence, dark suit and tie, with a way of moving that didn't disturb the air around him. He had noticed the empty chair from the start. He had also noticed when her face changed after she looked at her phone. "Would you prefer that I remove the other glass?" he asked in a low tone that didn't reach the other tables. Meredith looked at him. It was Caleb. She had read the name on his badge when he first approached the table. A man around 35, with eyes that had that rare quality of looking at a person without judging, only seeing. "Yes," she answered, her voice coming out too thin. Caleb took the glass carefully, but he didn't step away immediately. He stayed 1 second longer, a second that was too much for protocol and exactly what she needed, without knowing she needed it. "Can I bring you something besides the wine?" he said. "The kitchen made an herbal broth today that's not on the menu. Sometimes it helps." Meredith stared at him for a moment. It was strange that. It wasn't an intrusion. It was as if he had noticed there was a person there going through something, not just a customer whose dinner date was running late. "What's your name?" she asked. "Caleb Hudson, ma'am." She nodded. "You can bring the broth, Caleb." When he went to get it, she took a deep breath and gazed out at the dining room. The restaurant was one of the oldest in Chicago, with those dark wood-paneled walls, the chandeliers casting a golden light over everything, the tables spaced with the generous room that only places like this offer. She had first come here with her father when she was little, and she kept that memory with a tenderness that hadn't aged. And it had been she herself who had suggested the place for the birthday dinner with Bradley Montgomery. Bradley, as everyone called him. A man of 40, good-looking, well-spoken, who had come into her life 11 months ago, with an ease she had interpreted as a sign that he was right, that sometimes things arrive without cost because they are in the right place. She had miscalculated. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Anyway, moving on. Meredith had a habit of noticing what was wrong too late. Not for lack of intelligence, it was almost the opposite. She processed everything very quickly, and when something didn't add up, she would build an explanation herself to close what was left open. It was a skill that had served her well in business, where gaps need solutions, not contemplation. But in personal relationships, that same skill became a sophisticated way of deceiving herself. Bradley liked to ask about the business. At first, she had liked that, had taken it as interest in her life. Then she began to notice that the questions had a particular focus, about values, about structure, about who decided what. There was the time he asked casually during a dinner at home how much the property upstate had appreciated over the last 5 years, and the time he suggested that maybe they should formalize their relationship, that it would give them both security. At the time, she had glossed over these things with the same skill she used to close gaps, but each one had been tucked away somewhere she didn't want to visit. Caleb came back with the broth in a small ceramic bowl and an artisan bread roll on the side that she hadn't ordered. He set it down with the same care as always. "I didn't order the bread," she said. "You didn't." He gave a small smile without vanity. "But the kitchen always sends one with this broth. It's their tradition." She stared at the bread for a second. Then she said, without planning it, "Do you do that with everyone? Bring what wasn't asked for?" Caleb paused for a moment before answering. "Sometimes you can tell when a person is asking for one thing and needing another." That hung in the air between them. Meredith didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. She just began eating the bread slowly and the broth, and she grew quiet with that phrase while the Heritage Grill continued around her with a life of its own. There was something about that man she couldn't classify, and she classified everything. Her phone buzzed. Paige, her assistant of so many years, who had become something beyond an assistant, because life does that to people when we spend enough time together. "I saw you didn't check in. Are you okay?" Meredith typed yes and sent it without thinking. Then she stared at the word and thought that a lie told by text is sometimes easier to sustain because you don't have to look at anyone while you say it. It wasn't exactly a lie. She was sitting, she was breathing, the broth was good, but there was something inside her, that specific thing that happens when you discover that a suspicion you had carried for months was a justified one, and that all those moments when she told herself she was exaggerating were moments when she had been honest and hadn't wanted to listen. She was on her second glass of wine when the door of the Heritage Grill opened. She recognized the silhouette before seeing the face. There are people you recognize by the way they walk, by the weight of their steps, by the way they occupy space. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling was 72 years old and still carried an elegance that wasn't a pose. It was decades of sediment. Well-kept grey hair, a dark blue dress, small earrings she had worn since before Meredith was born. She walked to the table with the calm of someone who isn't in a hurry, but also isn't wasting time. Meredith watched her arrive and was speechless for a moment. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Eleanor pulled out the empty chair, Bradley's chair, and sat down with a naturalness that felt like a statement. "Paige called me." "She shouldn't have done that. And you shouldn't have said you were fine when you weren't." Eleanor's voice had no harshness, just that firmness that comes from knowing the other person too deeply to pretend not to see. "I came because I want to be here. If you want me to leave, I will. But first, let me stay a while." Meredith looked at her mother for a time that had no measure. Eleanor didn't have that look of pity that sometimes hurts more than the situation itself. She had a look of presence, of someone who stands by you without needing to fix things. "Bradley didn't come," Meredith said. It was information her mother probably already knew, but saying it out loud carried a different weight. "I know. Did you know something was going to happen?" Eleanor rested her hands on the table, hands that had worked hard, that had buried dreams and planted others, that had held her children in moments that couldn't be fixed. "I didn't know it would be today, but I knew Bradley wasn't what you needed." Meredith felt a pang that wasn't anger. It was something older. "Then why did you never say anything to me?" "Because once I tried to say something about a man you were dating, you told me I had never approved of anyone you chose." Eleanor paused briefly. "And you weren't entirely wrong, so I learned to stay quiet." I needed to pause here when I read this part. Because there's a distance we create with the person we love most, precisely because they're the one with the most power to hurt us. And then that distance becomes a habit nobody wanted, but it kept growing on both sides. Meredith remembered the conversation. She remembered saying that with an anger that was more fear than anger on a difficult day years ago, and she had never imagined that her mother had carried that as an instruction. Caleb approached, discreetly asking if he could bring anything. Eleanor ordered a fresh mint tea and thanked him with a nod of genuine kindness. When he went to get it, her mother looked at her daughter. "There's something I need to tell you. I've been holding on to it for 3 weeks because I didn't know how to say it." Meredith felt her stomach tighten. "Mr. Harrison called me." Mr. Harrison was the family lawyer, a man in his late 60s who had worked with them since before Meredith took over the business. Bradley went to talk to him. He wanted to understand how prenuptial asset division works when one partner has much more wealth. He asked about what would happen if you got married and then separated. The silence that settled between them was the kind that doesn't invite anyone in. "They're not married," Meredith said, her voice sounding more controlled than she actually was. "No, but he wanted to know about the hypothetical scenario." Eleanor looked at her daughter without looking away. "Mr. Harrison called me because he's known the family for decades and didn't feel right keeping that to himself. I've been carrying that weight for weeks without knowing the right moment to say it." The pieces slowly came together inside Meredith, like those times when you look at a scattered puzzle and suddenly see the image before putting it all together. Bradley's questions about the business, the casual suggestion of formalizing the relationship, the time he asked if she had updated her will, just to be safe, things she had folded and stored in a drawer that was now opening on its own. She had seen it, and she had preferred not to see it, because it was easier to believe she was loved than to admit she was being planned for. "Why didn't he come today?" she said, more to herself. "Maybe he noticed you were starting to get suspicious." Eleanor picked up the tea that Caleb had brought with that same care as always. Or maybe he found an easier way. What matters now isn't him. Then what matters? What matters is what you're going to do with what you know. What matters is you stop carrying alone the idea that there's something in you that doesn't deserve to be truly loved. Eleanor's voice dropped a notch. "Because that idea isn't true, Meredith. But I know it won't do any good for me to say it if you don't come to that conclusion yourself. There are things a mother says that we spend our whole lives trying not to need to hear. And then comes a moment when those words arrive at exactly the right time and slip through a crack we didn't even know was open." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The restaurant emptied with the patience of nights that are in no hurry. Tables were cleared, voices grew quieter, the background music gained more space. Mother and daughter sat together for a time, neither of them measured, talking about small things and big things, the way you only talk when your guard is down. Meredith told her about the first time she realized Bradley had a different kind of interest. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Then she told her about the day Meredith's father had proposed to her in a garden chair, with the ease of someone who never had a doubt, and how she had understood in that moment that true love has no calculation because it doesn't need to. Meredith listened to that story with an attention she had never had before. Caleb appeared a few times, always just the right amount, neither intruding nor disappearing. On his last pass, when the restaurant was almost empty, he brought the check without anyone asking, because he could tell they were reaching the natural end of that time, and placed beside it a small cream-colored card. Meredith looked at the card with a questioning expression. "Sometimes we offer a special breakfast on Saturdays," he said, in that same quiet voice of his. "For anyone who wants to come back on a calmer day, you're both welcome if you'd like." It was a simple gesture. It wasn't a move. It had no visible ulterior motive. It was just one person saying to another, "You can come back here and you'll be welcome." Eleanor looked at the card, looked at her daughter and said nothing, but the corner of her eye smiled. When they left, the night air was cooler than when they'd arrived, with that scent of garden that appears when you least expect it in a big city. They walked slowly to the parking lot in no hurry. "Come sleep at my house tonight," Eleanor said. Meredith thought about her house waiting for her, big and silent, with that silence that has its own texture when you're alone in a way you didn't choose. She thought about lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling with that conversation spinning in her head. "Okay," she said. Eleanor brushed her arm against Meredith's as they walked and said nothing more. And she didn't need to. In the days that followed, Meredith worked. It was what she knew how to do when she needed solid ground. She called a meeting with Mr. Harrison, not to talk about Bradley, but to review structures she had stopped looking at closely. She reorganized responsibilities at 2 of the properties. She called a manager who had been waiting for a response for weeks and gave him the answer he needed. She became again, with an awareness she hadn't had before, the person she had learned to be in her early 20s when the world seemed to be waiting for her. Bradley texted 4 days later, a long message with explanations that were apologies and apologies that were explanations, the way people do when they want to seem honest but are still protecting themselves. She read halfway through, closed it, didn't reply. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. The difference between the two is that anger makes noise and clarity is silent and stays. Paige called one afternoon. "I heard your mother came to get you at the Heritage Grill." "She did. How are you?" "Better." Meredith paused a second before continuing. "I think it's been a long time since I felt this good. You know, I always wanted to tell you that man wasn't right." "Why didn't you say it?" There was a pause on the other end. "Because you weren't ready to hear it. And I knew that because I was that person once, on the other side, when someone tried to tell me and I wouldn't listen." Meredith was quiet for a moment. "You should have said it anyway." "Maybe, but you're fine now, and that matters more." The following Saturday she went to the Heritage Grill. She had carried the card in her purse all week, without deciding anything, without planning anything. She woke up that morning with a specific craving for good coffee and for not being at the office or at home, and she went. The dining room was different by day, with natural light streaming through the tall windows and making everything less solemn. Caleb was there, with the same posture, a different apron over a more casual suit, setting tables for the coffee hour. When she walked in, he recognized her without exaggerated surprise, the way someone does when they had hoped she'd come back but weren't sure she would. "Good morning," he said. "Would you like a table by the window?" "Please." They sat down and he brought the coffee before she asked. They talked as the dining room slowly filled, not in a way she could have predicted, but in a way that felt natural from the start. She learned that he had been an elementary school teacher for 12 years at a public school in a Chicago neighborhood before the school went through a restructuring process that had left several teachers without classrooms. That he was studying again in a night course while working. That he had an 8-year-old daughter who read more than most adults he knew, and that filled him with a pride he didn't hide. "Are you going back to the classroom?" she asked. "Yes." There was no hesitation at all in the answer. "That's the plan. It always was." There was something in that man that she kept trying to name while she drank her coffee. And then, when he went to get more water and she was alone for a second, she understood what it was. He wasn't trying to be anything other than what he was. He wasn't selling himself, wasn't making himself small. He was just there, whole, with no cover charge and no surprise saved for the end. She left that morning with the little notebook she always carried with her and with an idea that took shape on the way back. In the days that followed, she talked to Mr. Harrison about a job opening that had sat vacant for months on the management team of the events hall at one of the family's hotels. A position that required exactly the profile she had observed: discretion, reading people, the ability to take care of a space without being seen taking care of it. She called Caleb 2 weeks later and presented the proposal directly, as she always did. She explained the position, what she expected, what the opening offered. She didn't mix the professional with anything else, because that distinction was important to her, and she knew how to do it. He asked for 2 days to think it over. He got back to her the next morning. "I accept," he said by text, "and I appreciate the trust." Eleanor found out through Mr. Harrison's grandson, who was working during the same weeks the negotiations were taking place. She called her daughter on a sunny afternoon. "I heard you hired the waiter from the Heritage Grill." "I hired a professional for a position that had been open for months." "I know." Eleanor's voice had a smile inside it. "And you did well." "He's competent, Mother." "Yes, but you also did well for yourself." A pause. "You're starting to trust what you see, not just what you want to see. That's different, Meredith, and it's big." Meredith sat with that for a long time after hanging up. She sat on the office porch, looking out at the garden her father had planted and that she had carefully maintained all these years, and she just breathed. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Life doesn't work that way, and she knew that better than anyone. There would be more challenges in business, more difficult conversations with her mother, more nights when the silence weighed heavy. There were scars that don't heal quickly, and fears that don't disappear with one decision. But there was also that new thing she was learning to recognize, the difference between loneliness and solitude, between being alone because no one showed up and being alone because she had chosen not to lose herself just to avoid being alone. It was a beginning, a real beginning, with solid ground, no shortcuts. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough to be enough. The end. And you? What would you have done in her place? Would you have stayed quiet longer, or would you have faced it sooner? Tell us in the comments. I read everything with great care. If this story touched you in any way, the like and subscribing to the channel are the best way to help us keep bringing you more stories like this one. Thank you so much for your company. Truly.